Good day, everyone, and welcome to the QEM Heroes webinar series. I'm Christine Wood, and I serve as the Assistant Program Director for the Heroes Fellows Program at QEM. And for more than 30 years, QEM has been a national catalyst for STEM education transformation and research capacity building. Currently, the QEM network serves nearly 900 colleges and universities and reaches more than 8,000 individuals nationwide. This webinar is part of the HEROES initiative. The HEROES program brings together former federal scientists to lend their expertise and support to the STEM research and education communities. Our fellows are here to provide tools and tips for navigating the funding landscape, developing STEM programs and partnerships, and improving talent retention in in-demand fields. We hope this series promotes engagement with our HEROES fellows and provides valuable resources to our participants. The webinar recordings and slides will be available in the QEM Resource Hub. By attending this webinar, you will soon be added to the QEM network and granted access to the hub. And I'm so happy to introduce our presenter today, one of our Heroes Fellows. Dr. Josh Trapani is a geoscientist who has spent the past 20 years working in federal science policy. His experience includes past roles at the National Science Foundation and the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics on Capitol Hill and with the Association of American Universities, a higher education association focused on federal advocacy on research and higher education issues. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Trapani.
Thank you, Christine. Let me share my screen. Okay, hopefully you all can see that. Now let me get this out of the way. Um, and thank you all for being willing to come learn more about university research funding data. I was worried that it sounded like too wonky of a topic, but I hope I will convince you that it is also fascinating and very important. I've structured this webinar to give you a few aspects of the issue, so I want to get right into it. So I'm going to start with an overview, and we will look at data about university research expenditures from a variety of different perspectives. Then we'll start to zoom in on how these data get used in the real world, with a brief aside about limitations to the data. The main source of the data that we'll be talking about today is the NCSES Higher Education Research and Development Survey, known as the HERD survey. So I'll give you a brief intro to that data source, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then finally, we'll take the last chunk of the hour for some demos about how to access and use these data. So that is a lot to cover. And I want to put in a plea that I will reiterate at the end, which is if you'd like to see future webinars that dive deeper into any of these topics, cover different or related ones, please provide it as feedback after the webinar. Christine will tell you about how to do that. The other Heroes Fellows and I are really trying to make these webinars interesting, relevant, and helpful for you. And so your feedback on that is really important. Okay, I have three objectives for this webinar. By the end, I would like you to feel as though you understand the big picture for university R&D. I would like you to feel as though you know pretty much what you can do with the data, but also have some idea of what the limitations are. And then finally, my hope is that you feel fairly confident, at least, that you can access the data and you can use it. Okay, so I'm going to start with an overview about funding for university R&D, and I wanted to start with a poll question for you all to consider just to see what you think. So Christine, when you're ready, if you could put up the first poll question. The first question is, what percentage of total research and development in the United States is performed by colleges and universities? So why don't you take a guess? I'm curious to see what you all think. We'll give you a minute to take the poll, and then we'll take a look at the results, and I'll show you what the answer is, and we'll move forward from there.
I'll give you all a few seconds to complete the poll. Please participate if you can.
Just guess. We won't know who guessed what. Okay, I can see the results. Uh, 53% of you said 75%. 33% of you said 37%. 11% of you said 11%, and none of you said 2%. So this is great because actually very few of you got it correct, which means this webinar will be helpful. The answer is that higher education only performs about 11% of all US research and development. As you can see here, the overwhelming majority of US R&D is performed by the business sector. Higher education is second. It performs more than any other sector, including the federal government. You can see here federal is broken out into intramural, which is when agencies do the research, and FFRDCs, the federally funded research and development centers. But even if you sum those, it's not as much as higher education. Now, what we're looking at here, though, is all US research and development, undifferentiated in any way. And when we break it down a little bit, we can introduce some nuance into this picture. So before I do that, though, I want to take a brief pause to be sure we're clear on a few terms. A lot of federal statistics about research and development talk about funders of research and performers of research. The meaning of these terms is fairly self-evident, but the funder of the research is the entity that puts forward the money for the research, and the performer is the entity that actually does the research. So these can be the same as when business both funds and performs research, or they can be different. For instance, the government funds a lot of research that higher education performs. Okay. Also, and any of you who might have been in my last webinar about federal appropriations heard this already, we talked about how research and development is often classified into three categories: basic research, applied research, and experimental development. So basic research is experimental or theoretical work that's undertaken primarily to acquire new knowledge and without any particular application or use in mind. So if you're a university faculty member doing research, more likely than not, you're doing mostly basic research. Applied research is also like basic, undertaken to acquire new knowledge, but it's directed primarily toward a specific practical aim or objective. And then experimental development is work that's directed to producing new products or processes or to improving existing products or processes. And it's important, a lot of sources will break out research by these three topics. So now, what this chart is showing you is how much, that is, what percentage of the US total of each of these categories are funded and performed by the higher education sector. And so you can see the higher education sector is responsible for almost 50% of performance of the nation's basic research. They fund about, what is that, 15% of it. They perform nearly 20% of the nation's applied research and fund maybe 5% of it. And then they perform and fund very small percentages of experimental development. So now in the next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to take these data and we're going to look at them again, but we're going to add all the other sectors back in. So when we add the other sectors back in, we get a fuller picture of what's going on in US research and development. We can see these dark blue bars are higher education, and we can see that in performance and funding of basic research, higher education plays a pretty major role. In applied research, higher education plays a small but still significant role. And in performance and funding of experimental development, it's a very small role. So higher education has a distinct niche in the overall US R&D ecosystem that is focused largely, but not entirely, on basic research. So to this point, we have drawn on a few different data sources, but from here on out, every slide I'll show you with data draws those data from the HERD survey. So HERD, or the Higher Education Research and Development Survey, looks at higher ed R&D performance by looking at dollars expended. And one of the questions the survey asks is about the type of research. And so you can see here overall, the lower bar is for the most recent survey year, that's 2024. And we have basic and applied and experimental development here. And you can see about 63% of the research performed by universities, basic, little more than a quarter is applied, and about 10% is experimental development. If we compare it to 2010, which is the first year that the HERD survey took its current form, we can see the percentages are pretty similar, but there's been a small decline in the percentage that's being performed of basic research and small increases in applied research and development. So things are changing, but they're not changing much in terms of the composition of university research, at least between 2010 and 2024. Now, if we start to turn our attention to who funds university of research, here is a trend that goes all the way back to 1970 through 2024 that shows higher education R&D in dollars, unadjusted for inflation, broken out by the funder. And we can see that it's grown quite a lot over the years. The dark blue bar, the federal government, is the largest funder and has always been the largest funder of university research. The green are institutions' own funds, which are a smaller but growing share. Let's see. State and local government is the orange, business is the blue, and these are small shares that have stayed pretty small. And then all other sources is the purple, and that also includes nonprofit sources. So this is interesting and it shows the growth of the enterprise over time, but it's a little hard from the way I'm showing this here to kind of pick out what some of the trends are in terms of the relative funders. So what I'm going to show you in the next slide is a different view where I have taken just the decade years from 1970 to 2020, and I have broken out these same funders by the percentage of total R&D, university R&D that they're responsible for funding. So here things become a little bit clearer in that the federal share has declined over time from around 70% back in the early years of the data collection to just over half now. The university's own share has increased to a full quarter from quite a bit less. State and local government has declined a little bit in terms of a percentage. Business has grown a little bit, but really just a little bit. And all other sources, again, think about nonprofits, especially in recent years, has also grown, but not really very much. I think that there is a separate from today, but very relevant conversation that could be had about how universities can grow and diversify those particular funding sources. And I mean, especially business and nonprofit funding, at a time when the federal government is questioning its commitment to university-funded R&D, because these are not big numbers in terms of the amount of growth that we've seen here. So now, when universities spend money on research, what are they spending on? So the HERD survey asks about this, and it breaks out the categories. And these are the results for the most recent year. It has direct costs as well as indirect costs. You can see that the biggest costs of research are salaries, wages, and fringe benefits by far. That is basically the people who perform the research. Other direct costs would be the second category. So this includes things like travel, tuition waivers, consulting, supplies, computer usage fees. It's a whole bunch of stuff that's included here. Passed through to subrecipients would be money that an institution receives but then passes on to another institution through a subaward. And then we have capitalized equipment and software. Indirect costs are broken out into recovered. Those are the costs that the university expends that they are reimbursed for by the federal government or whoever the funder is, and unrecovered indirect costs, which are those for which the university is not reimbursed. As most of you probably know, unrecovered indirect costs has long been a hot button issue. Institutions have been claiming larger and larger amounts of unrecovered indirect costs, while some outside universities are skeptical, and that includes the current administration, which has proposed capping those costs. And we can talk more about indirect cost recovery when we get to the Q&A if people are interested. But the HERD is one important source of data for indirect costs. So now let's take a look at higher ed research and development by field. This is for 2023, but the numbers really don't change very much from year to year, so I thought this worked just fine. You can see very clearly that life sciences dominates academic research and development. In 2024, it was 57% of the total. Engineering is second, it was 16%. So together, engineering and life sciences are about 3/4 of total academic R&D research expenditures. And then you can see here that other fields have smaller shares. The survey does break things out more finely than these big fields, but this just gives you some idea. If we want to understand the drivers of this field-based pattern, when we take a look at federal agencies, it kind of gives us some idea of why this is the way it is. So I really do like this next visualization here. What it's showing you are the main federal agencies that fund academic R&D and their funding broken out by main field. And we can see what some of the drivers of this field-based pattern are for university R&D, but we can also see how the agencies' portfolios differ depending upon their mission. So one thing that stands out right away is that HHS, which is Health and Human Services, but we're mostly talking about NIH here, has an enormous amount of funding for life sciences. And a lot of the other agencies also have a fair bit of funding for life sciences. That's the dark blue here. Engineering is the orange that's here. And so when we look agency by agency, we can see, as we would expect, HHS is, vast majority of it is life sciences. DoD has a lot of engineering, although it's got a pretty diversified portfolio. NSF has a very diversified portfolio because its mission is to fund basic research across the fields of science. DOE, Department of Energy, is very focused on engineering and physical sciences, as is NASA. USDA has quite a bit of life sciences. They also fund quite a bit of social sciences like economics. And so by looking at this, we can kind of get an idea of, for the main funding source, where's the money coming from in terms of the field. So as all of you are no doubt aware, funding for university research and development is not distributed equally. And I'd like to show you now some data about that, and then we will transition to our next topic. So I wanted to start this section with a poll question, my second poll question for you. And that is, when it comes up, that the 25 universities with the most research and development expenditures are responsible for what percentage of total expenditures across all higher education institutions? So if we just took the top 25, what percentage of the total would those 25 be responsible for? We'll just take a stab at it. All right, we have a very diversified answer. 15% of you said 16%, 20% of you said 37%, 30% of you said 52%, and 35% of you said 63%. The answer is actually B, about 37%. You can see here what I've plotted out is, this again is for 2024, the most recent year. The blue line are total expenditures, research expenditures for higher ed. The red line is federal expenditures, and I'm showing you here what percentage of the total the top 10 are responsible for, top 25, top 50, and top 100. And it sort of scales, actually. I didn't realize it was going to do this when I made the plot. The top 10 are responsible for about 20%, the top 25, 37, roughly 40%, the top 50, roughly 60%, and the top 100, roughly 80%. Now for the HERD survey, let me just tell you that the HERD survey surveyed 925 institutions in 2024. So there are 825 institutions in that remaining 20%. I didn't go any further with my numbers, but just to give you some idea. And so that's the distribution that we have right now. So as R&D expenditures are unevenly distributed across institutions, the same is true for states. This heat map shows total expenditures by state for 2024. And when we look over here at the scale, we can see almost 2 orders of magnitude difference between the state with the highest expenditures and the state with the lowest. And if we rank states by their research expenditures and we look at the distribution, we can see that the 5 states with the highest research expenditures are responsible for 40%. The next 5 states, another 20%. And when we look down here, we can see even if we sum up the bottom 10 states in terms of research expenditures, we're looking at about 2.5%. So there is a real skew in the way that this money is distributed. Now, this unequal distribution is, of course, well known. It's one of the reasons why, for instance, the EPSCoR program exists and has existed for a very long time. One thing that you might notice here is that the darker colored states on the map tend to be the biggest population-wise. So one thing that I was curious about was the relationship between state population and university research expenditures. And so I want to take a look at that quickly here. Okay, so here you can see the top 10 states in terms of expenditures in 2024, and I've got the state, the amount of expenditures, its rank, and the percent of the total. And then on the right, I got the population. These are census data. It's similar. I got the population, the rank, and the percentage of the total. You can see that there is a lot of overlap in the lists. The percentages that we're looking at are fairly similar. But there are some differences that are worth pointing out. So we can see, for instance, that Maryland and Massachusetts are both within the top 10 in terms of expenditures, and they are not on the top 10 list for population. And we're gonna get back to the Maryland case in a little bit later in a few slides. Florida is on both lists, but I thought it worth pointing out that it ranks 10th for expenditures and 3rd for population. And then we can see Ohio and Michigan are both on the top 10 list in terms of population and not in terms of expenditures. So there are definitely some differences here. I did the same thing for the lowest ranked states, but I did want to pause for a third poll question. After this, there's only one more poll question, so enjoy. Which U.S. state do you think had the lowest university R&D expenditures in 2024? Don't look it up, please. I wonder, I have not done this, but if you typed it into Google, I wonder if Google's AI would be good enough to give you the right answer. You flip a coin. I have not had good experiences with Google's AI. Okay. 23% of you said South Dakota, 18% of you said Alaska, 36% of you said Wyoming, and 23% of you said West Virginia. So the answer was very split. As it turns out, the answer is South Dakota, which had $142.4 million worth of expenditures in 2024. But you can see where a lot of the other states that I put on the list rank relative to them. There's not a huge difference. So this shows you the lowest ranked states with the table set up the same way as the tables in the last slide. 51 because I included DC. Here is the population table, again, set up the same way. Here there are definitely more differences. So we can see Hawaii, Nevada, West Virginia, and Idaho all show up on the bottom 10 for research expenditures, but not for population. And we can see Montana, Rhode Island, Delaware, and DC show up on the bottom 10 for population, but not for research expenditures. Now, of course, university R&D expenditures in a state are related to more than just the population of the state. They can be related to the number of universities, the organization of those universities, the industries located in the state, the educational attainment of the population, and a range of other factors. But I do think that, there are a lot of ways to sort of visualize how states and universities vary in their research expenditures, and this was one way of taking a look at it. So I have one more data slide for some overall perspective, and then we're going to move on. And what I wanted to show you here was just to give you some overall general perspective on how different aggregations of funding and universities compare in this survey. So I've got different aggregations over here. And then on the right side of the bar, the first number is the number of institutions that were included in that aggregation. And then I've got the dollar figure. So the entire survey, 925 institutions, about $118 billion of total research expenditures in 2024. Here you can see public universities. You can see all of the federally financed expenditures. So almost all the institutions in the survey had at least some federal research expenditures. Here are the top 25 that we talked about before, and so you could see where they fall relative to the total. This is all medical school expenditures at all institutions. So we saw the big role of HHS, life sciences. Um, this is actually not, just to be clear, this is not all expenditures at universities that have medical schools. This is all medical school expenditures. If you're a university that has a medical school, you may have tons of other NIH money that is not shown here. This is just money that goes to medical schools. Private universities over here. Here are the top 10 institutions. I also included high Hispanic enrollment institutions, at least as HERD is classifying them. All emerging research institutions, and this was my attempt to get at ERIs, and I did that by basically just cutting off federal research expenditures at $50 million and looking at summing up the total research expenditures for the ones that fell below that threshold. And you can see it's the vast majority of institutions in the survey. All the non-doctorate granting universities, and then HBCUs. And if there are HBCUs or others that don't report any federal research expenditures and don't take part in the survey, they wouldn't be included in the total. Okay, so now it's time to switch gears and consider how these data get used. Well, the first, which we just spent a good chunk of time walking through, is there a use to look at the big picture for university research and development, and sometimes to put universities research and development in the context of overall national trends. And we basically just walk through one look at that. Individual institutions also use them a lot for ranking and benchmarking. I did some of that a few slides ago, except it was for states, not for institutions. Even the HERD survey itself produces a lot of different rankings tables, and we'll look at those tables when we get towards the end of the webinar. And on one hand, I always thought it was sort of peculiar that a federal survey is producing rankings. But on the other hand, I think it's what the higher education institutions want from the survey, and they are the ones who are the respondents who are putting in the time and effort into filling out the survey each year. Her data are also used for institutional classifications. I'm sure you're all well aware of the Carnegie classifications on the left, and these data play a role in those. Her data have also been cited in legislation to define certain classes of institutions. So this language is from the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, and it defines emerging research institutions as institutions that have not more than $50 million in annual federally financed R&D expenditures for S&E, as reported through, again, the HERD survey. So they are citing that as the definitive source for what becomes an ERI. Relatedly, research expenditure data are part of the membership criteria for the Association of American Universities. This is an association of select public and private U.S. research universities. I worked for this organization for 6 years. I actually ran the membership data for them. They have a committee of presidents and chancellors that meet twice a year and take a look at these data for a whole range of institutions to consider whether they should expand the membership or in rare cases, whether they should kick an institution out, and that has happened. And they have a variety of different criteria that they use for membership, but one of the first, most important ones are the herd research expenditures data. Now, while I don't think herd reporting has actually caused institutions to reorganize themselves, it has certainly been viewed as a nice co-benefit in some cases. And here is one case where in the University of Maryland, Baltimore, and the University of Maryland, College Park formed a partnership and in 2019 began reporting to herd as a single summed entity rather than as two separate entities. This is a relationship that was involved an act passed by the Maryland General Assembly, and it changed the way that the institutions report to herd. And you can see here they are quite proud of the fact that their summed up research expenditures are bringing them into the top 10, with the president of one of the universities even mentioning the herd survey by name in the quote about how happy they are that their university rankings have gone up. And then finally, these data, and I kind of alluded to this before, are used all the time in policy and advocacy. We talked about the indirect cost rate issue. Herd data are cited all the time as evidence for one side or the other. AAU is always advocating on behalf of more federal research money, but also for other things. They had this piece. Universities are the second largest funders of research, and they still can't backfill federal cuts. So we just looked at those data, and they used the herd data to basically make this case for why federal funding remains so important. This is another snippet of a piece of a website from another association where they're also using herd data to make the case for the importance of federal funding for university research. And this is a piece that appeared recently in Issues in Science and Technology. I actually helped edit this piece by an administrator where he's talking about how universities need to do a more thorough job documenting all of the inputs that they put into the research enterprise. And there's a lot of talk in here about the herd survey and how it could be improved. I've got a link to this at the end of my resources slide if you're interested in it. Okay, so now we are about to transition into talking about the details of the herd survey and looking at the data ourselves. But before we do that, I wanted to take a brief pause here and just consider limitations of these data. So we are talking about dollars. The herd survey counts up dollars and it uses them for all of these different purposes. So what are some of the things that dollars cannot tell us? And if I can get this to work, okay. There is just a lot that we really cannot understand from these data. We do not know who is doing the research. We don't know what their experiences are. We don't know what it means for their careers. This doesn't tell us anything about the quality of the research, how it's performed, what comes out of it. We don't know how different universities approach research and building their portfolios. We don't know how the research they do feeds back to their students or their communities or their overall institutional missions. And there's a lot even just about the funding itself that we don't know. We don't know exactly which businesses and nonprofits are major players in funding the research, or even about from the federal government how many awards or their durations or what departments they're going to. And some of that data you can find elsewhere, but it's not here in the herd survey when we boil it down to dollars. You can probably think of more things that we should add to this list that I put on the slide. I just wanted to make the point that when we choose these simple metrics as representatives of so many things, we need to remember their limitations. And there is a really fantastic essay by Sethi Nguyen about the limits of data that I linked to this in my resources slide. It's definitely worth reading. He's a philosophy professor. He now has a book out that came out, I think, earlier this year about metrics. It's called The Score, and it's really good. It's worth reading. With that caveat in mind, let's dig into the survey itself, and then we'll look how to get the data. Okay. So the herd survey began in its current form, as we talked about, in 2010. It grew out of an earlier NCSES survey, the NSF Survey of Research and Development Expenditures at Universities and Colleges, also referred to as the Academic R&D Expenditures Survey, which started in 1972. There are some data that go back even further, but That's kind of the beginning of what we consider the herd survey. It's administered by the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics and CSES, the National Science Foundation. That's an independent federal statistical agency that's located within NSF. I worked there for about 3 years. I work with these data a lot. That's that. It is a census survey, so it surveys all of the relevant institutions. It collects information annually from US colleges and universities that have spent at least $150,000 for research and development in the past fiscal year. As we saw, it collects detailed information on expenditures across fields, and this includes the science and engineering field, and since 2010, the non-science and engineering field, by funder, by the type of R&D, so basic, applied, experimental, as well as some other things about head counts and FTEs that kind of less useful, and then some characteristics of the institutions themselves. And importantly, and this will become important, it utilizes a standard and a short form to minimize burden on smaller institutions. So for institutions that have less than, I think it's $1 million in expenditures, they get an abbreviated version of the form. And that means that while there are a lot of data that we can get for all the institutions, some of the detail is there just for the institutions that have more than $1 million. Now we get most of the money accounted for that way, but we may miss some things in terms of some of the smaller institutions. Okay, so with that caveat in mind, let's dig into the survey itself, and then we'll look how to get the data. Okay, last poll question for you, because like any good survey, this one has its quirks. And I want to show you two of them just to give you a dose of, knowing you may need to take some of this with a grain of salt. So the poll question is, which institution has had the highest expenditures ranking in the herd survey every single year since 1979? There is one.
Be careful, everybody. I think this is a trick question.
It is and it isn't. There is a trick built into one part of it, but oh well, if it's a trick question, then you all fell for the trick. Um, 18% of you said Harvard, 59% of you said University of California System, and 24% of you said Johns Hopkins. So the trick that Tarina was talking about, I think, Tarina, you're talking about this, is the University of California System does not report to HERD as a single entity, right? It reports to separate campuses.
Exactly.
Is that what you're
Mhm.
talking about? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So you got that. You picked up on the trick. Most of you didn't, but the answer is actually Johns Hopkins. Um, and remember some slides ago how high Maryland ranked in expenditures. This is part of why. So here, if you look here, we're looking at the last 4 years of data. We're looking at just the top 3 institutions. So take a look at this. It's not even close, right? Now, why would that be? So this is when we have to start to look at all the little numbers and letters they stick on these tables. So this little a, Johns Hopkins University includes the Applied Physics Laboratory with $2.5 billion in total, almost all of which is federal. Um, and so that's part of it. But the question is, why does Johns Hopkins get this thing tacked onto it that no one else gets tacked on? Especially because I always thought that APL was a federally funded research and development center, and FFRDC, well, and those you are not supposed to report in the herd survey. Well, as it turns out, APL is not an FFRDC. It's a UARC, a university affiliated research center, a strategic Department of Defense research center that's associated with the university. So this is a nonprofit US Navy sponsored research center. And so here, fun fact, there are 15 of these UARCs, all under special authority of the US Code. And the most recent one, created in 2023, is a Research Institute for Tactical Autonomy, which is led by Howard University, performing research for the US Air Force. And it is recent enough that it's not on my little chart here, which shows all of the UARCs, except for that one. And the reason why I'm showing you this chart is it separates out the amount that went to the university that is not UARC and the amount that went to the university for the UARC. And you can see there is one institution that stands out pretty starkly here. And UARCs are included in the herd expenditures, but you can see in most cases that's not going to make a tremendous amount of difference. And in one case, it makes a massive amount of difference. As it turns out, the Applied Physics Lab is the original UARC. It dates from 1942. Now, do you need to know this in order to work with the herd survey data? Like, absolutely not. I'm sure this seems like totally arcane. The reason why I'm going into all of this, though, is that when you see something weird, there's probably a reason why it looks so weird, and it's worth kind of digging in to try to figure out at least a little bit of it, because there are some oddities in this survey. I'll give you one more instance. I'm not going to quiz you on this one. I'll just go through this one pretty quickly. A major university with no institutional spending on research. So here we have a table, a rankings table from her. This is from way back in FY 2011, and we're kind of down in the rankings table around 26 to 30. Harvard University, of all universities, looks a little weird here. It reports no institutional spending whatsoever on research. And in fact, Harvard had reported none in 2010 too. And then what happened was we were in DC having one of our fights that we have about indirect cost reimbursement, and a member of Congress said, "Why should we be giving universities more money for their indirect costs when Harvard University, of all universities out there, says that it hasn't put any of its own resources into research and development on its own campus?" And Harvard said, "Oh, no, 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 wait. It's not that we didn't put any in, we just didn't bother to report the number." And so Harvard then very promptly began reporting institutional research expenditures, and you can see the trend. Took it a couple of years to kind of get adjusted, and then it kind of settled into a groove. And the reason why I'm showing you this one too, since it's somewhat some time in the past, is just to highlight that different institutions may be motivated to put different amounts of effort into reporting. These data are self-reported by institutions. Different institutions may also be capable of putting different amounts of effort in, given their capacity. And that's part of why the herd survey has a standard and a short form. Okay, so now it's time to dive into the data. There are two ways I'm going to show you today to access these data. One or the other may be better for you depending on what you're hoping to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through each of these, and then I always figure the best way to learn how to navigate something is to try to find some stuff in it. So we're going to try to answer a few questions so we can see how it works. So we're going to look at the herd survey tables and analysis, and we're going to try to answer, where does Florida A&M University rank on federally funded expenditures? And which agency provides the most funding for social sciences research at universities? Then we're going to move to the NCSCS table builder, which can be a little intimidating, but the way you learn how to use this is through a little bit of trial and error. And we're going to try to answer, how much funding for physical sciences does Howard University get versus UT at El Paso? Which of those institutions gets more federal money? What percentage of federal funding goes to HBCUs? What about HHEs? And then how do institutions, this is just trying to pull a whole bunch of stuff together, how do institutions in the state of Louisiana compare on DoD funding for physical sciences? Okay, so I'm going to stop my presentation. And Christine, if you're able to give them this link, that would be great. You can give them both links. But we're going to start with this, with the survey tables.
And the links are in the chat for everyone to access.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to try to find my browser. All right. So here we are at the first link. This is how a lot of NCSCS surveys are set up in terms of how they provide information. So if you're interested in SED or another survey, you'll see it set up pretty similarly. There are these tabs at the top. This one provides survey information. This one provides a lot of detail on the methodology, including questionnaires and technical tables. I'm going to focus on this tab here, data. NCSCS loves to put out lots of slice and dice tables of its different surveys. And so as you scroll through this page, you will see a lot of different tables that break out the herd data, sometimes trends, sometimes for single years, in lots of different ways. And there is really a lot of information that's here. If we open up any one of these tables, and let's just maybe pick this one. If we click on it, then the table opens up in a little window here, and we can see what we're looking at in terms of the columns and the rows. This is looking at all expenditures by source of funds and the survey population. So this one is going to show you all institutions, but then it's going to show you down here, it's going to break out the short form and the standard form. Remember, we talked about those two forms depending upon how much research expenditures the institution has. So you can look at the data here. If you want to, I don't know how often these things get shared on Twitter and Facebook, but if you want to send it as an email or copy the link, I don't know why it just brought me to the top, but if you copy the link, it will take you straight to the table like it did here. Now, if you want to download the table to use your own way, you click up here and you can download it as an Excel or as a PDF. I tend to like to download these things as Excels because usually I want to play with them one way or the other. So you download it and it will open up. And then you'll get the data here and you can play with it as you see fit or do calculations with it. So let's try to answer our questions. Where does Florida A&M University rank on federally funded expenditures? So one of the things that I'm not crazy about on these pages is they go on and on and on and on, but it's not totally clear where you would find certain things. So a lot of times I basically just use a simple find in page. Was it agency that I was searching at? Let's see. So if we start doing federal, this is the first thing that comes up. Total and federally financed higher education. I don't think that's what we want. This is what we want here. Federally financed higher education expenditures. Now, because yes, this is the table that we're looking for. So then what we would do is just open up the table. You can scroll down and try to find it, but it might be faster to just download the table, open it up. And we said we're looking for the Florida A&M. So I'm just gonna Florida A, and there we go. We can see it is ranked 172nd, and this is a trend in its federal expenditures. If we wanted other information about this institution, we'd just have to look at another table. The second question I wanted us to try to find was, which agency provides the most funding for social sciences research at universities? So here I'll just search for agency. Federally funded at institutions by federal agency and field. So if we open up this table, we're looking at agency over here and we're looking at field down here. We go down to social sciences and we can see it looks like HHS is the winner. NSF would be second. But if we were interested in economics, for instance, specifically, that's broken out here as well. So we could download this and we could do calculations on it, or maybe this is good enough for our purposes here. So this is the way the tables work. You do have to do some searching, but you'll usually be able to find a lot of what you're looking for in all these slices and dices. Okay, so now we're going to move to the second link, the table builder. And here is what the table builder looks like. This should send you directly to the table builder for the herd survey. You see it's got herd in the URL. If you wanted to work with another survey, you could just click it here on this tab. One nice thing is NCSES actually has IPEDS completions in this tabular builder, even though IPEDS is a Department of Education product. Can make it easier to deal with than some of the other ways to get the data. And the way that you do this is you essentially use measures and dimensions to build your table. So I think the best way to do this is to just start trying to answer our first question. which was how much funding for physical sciences does Howard University get versus the University of Texas at El Paso? So I want to do research expenditures for all institutions. We are interested in, well, we could do detailed funding source. So we want the source of the funding. So we add that to the table. It starts to show us data. Basically, we're basically just looking at the total. I'm really only interested in the current fiscal year. You can see this shows a trend. So I'll go into the survey cycle and click fiscal year. It's got all the years in here. I want to clear them and just add the most recent year. Update the table, and there we go. Now I'm interested in physical sciences, so I'm going to look down here in dimensions and field of study. Oh, now why isn't that there? It's not there because I picked the wrong one up here, I think. I need to actually do this instead. And this is it. It's going to be some trial and error when you work with this, especially because there are two forms of the survey. Sometimes the thing you're looking for isn't going to be there. And it's basically just a matter of playing with it a little bit. So now if we go back to field of study, what do you know? It's there. I'm only interested in the broad field here because I said physical sciences. So I'm going to add physical sciences. I'm going to add it as a column. You can choose to add it as a column or a row. And then I am interested in finding two institutions that we mentioned, Howard. I'm going to add Howard. And I said University of Texas at El Paso. So we're going to add those. I'm going to add them as a row to make it easier to see. And we can see this is the answer to the first question. It blows out the total, which in this case is the same as what we're looking at. We can see that the University of Texas at El Paso gets 9.9 million and Howard University gets 8.1 million. So UT El Paso gets more. But the second question was which one gets more federal money for physical sciences? So then we can look here at the funding source, federal and non-federal. I'll put those in as columns. Blow it out here. And we can see, we continue to blow it out, that actually Howard University gets more federal money, and UT El Paso gets less, but UT El Paso gets a lot of non-federal money. Now, if we want this off here, we want to do something with it. For any sort of table configuration, we can export. You can export as Excel or CSV. CSV gives you something more like you'd want to put into a pivot table or into Tableau. I'm going to download the Excel just so you can see it. It downloads always as the zip folder, and the zip folder has two. I don't know why they do it this way. There's a text file in here that's going to show you all of your different filters and the way that you set up your search. And then there's the actual data, which will be right here. And so if you wanted to calculate percentages or do something like that, you could do it. You could do it here. What percentage of federal money goes to HBCUs and HHEs? That's our next question. So I'm going to clear everything. And I am going to say research expenditures here. Add to the table. It's giving me the same sort of breakout as before. Again, let's just for simplicity's sake, make it just this year. And then we actually just want federal, right? And then under institutional characteristics, you can see the characteristics that they have here. Unfortunately, they don't have Carnegie classification, which has always been kind of a bummer. But for HBCUs, for instance, we could put that into a column. And then we can see right here what percentage goes to HBCUs versus not HBCUs and the total. Now, if we wanted to do some math on this, we download it the way I just showed you, right? Pretty quickly, we could download it. Let's see, how are we doing on time? Getting a little tight. And then we could just very easily run a formula on this. And so that would be our answer. Let's just say that we wanted to look at this by institution. We could essentially just take institutions and add them all. Now it's going to add every single institution here, which may be what we want. It may not be what we want. If we really just wanted to see the HBCUs, we would go back to HBCUs and take out the ones that are not. And then we can get a table that shows institution by institution. Because I'm running a little short on time, I think I'm going to not answer the last question. I'd be happy to do that at some other point. I think you guys get the idea of how this works. I wanted to just run through some take-home messages that universities fill an important role in the nation's R&D ecosystem is focused largely on basic research. The federal government provides the majority of the funding for university R&D, but its share is declining and higher ed's contributions are rising. Salaries, wages, and benefits make up the largest part of R&D expenditures, so it's the people. Life sciences dominates academic R&D, followed by engineering. These two together are about 3/4 of the total. University research expenditures are distributed unequally across institutions and geography. The herd survey is key, as we talked about. We saw how herd data are used by institutions and policymakers for different purposes. And we talked about also how these data, while they are very important, there are many things that the data don't capture. And then I just showed you some ways to access and try to use the data for your own purposes. I have this resources slide here, some of which are focused on the herd survey itself, ways to access the data, and then the readings that I talked about in addition to a few other reports that kind of get into these efforts. So I will conclude right there and turn it back to Christine.
Thank you, Dr. Trapani, for a very informative talk and very interactive. I wanted to summarize what's on these QR codes here. The QEM events page has our upcoming webinars and events. We would love for you to visit it to register for future webinars. The Heroes webpage is a summary of our Heroes program and lists all of our Heroes Fellows who you might contact for assistance in grant development or what have you. And our workshop feedback form, we would love your feedback. And Dr. Trapani would specifically like to know what you would like more of to hear in the future. And I am pasting that feedback form into the chat for everyone to access easily. So with 2 minutes to spare, I wanted to thank everyone for attending today. We do have about 2 minutes. If someone has a question, you can input it in the Q&A, raise your hand, or use the chat. I'll wait about a minute.
Let me add too that one of my links is to a video that shows you some guidance about how to use that table builder. I know the table builder is not the most user-friendly thing on earth, and there is just some trial and error that goes into it.
In the absence of questions, I will say good day to you all, and thank you so much for attending one of our QEM Heroes Fellowship Program webinars. And thank you, Dr. Trapani, for a wonderful presentation. Have a great day, everyone.